There's a lot going on in our reading today from the Gospel of John. Today on the 19th day of 66 and 26. There's the growing opposition to Jesus and his ministry from the religious leaders of the Jews. There is Jesus healing a man who is born blind. But what I want to focus on today actually is what happens with Jesus in John chapter 7. Now, in the Old Testament and at the time of Jesus, just like we have today certain holidays like Christmas, Good Friday, Easter, the Jewish people had holidays also. There were 3 holidays in the spring and 3 in the fall. So 6 major festivals for the Jewish people through the year. 3 of those 6 were known as pilgrimage festivals, which means that the Jewish people were expected to travel from their towns to the temple in Jerusalem. Two of those pilgrimage festivals were in the spring, the Passover and what was known as the Feast of Weeks. And one of those pilgrimage festivals was in the fall, what is known as the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, that's not a well-known festival to us who are not so acquainted with the Jewish practices. We might have heard of Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, which happens in September typically. And there is Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, which happens in late September or early October. And then there is the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. And the Feast of Tabernacles was an 8-day festival, where the other 2 festivals in the fall were 1-day festivals. The Feast of Tabernacles was 8 days. And the people of Israel were expected to travel to the temple to bring their praise and sacrifices. And one of the practices of the Feast of Tabernacles, and why it was called Tabernacles, was that the people lived in small huts, small little tabernacles, little more than 4 posts on the corners and some cross beams and some palm branches thrown across the top, maybe some fresh fruit hanging down as well. The tabernacles were meant to remind the people of Israel of their time with Moses as they came out of Egypt and on their way to the Promised Land, as they spent 40 years in the wilderness before entering the Promised Land. And while they were in the wilderness, they camped out in these small tents, these huts called tabernacles. And the custom all the way through the time of Jesus, and still going on today, the Jewish people remember that time in the desert through the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, in the Gospel of John, we're told that Jesus went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, and while he was there, something interesting happened. Now, it's not commanded in the Old Testament, but a custom that was going on at the time of Jesus for the Feast of Tabernacles was the priests would bring out a large jar, a clay jar of water from the temple, and they would pour it out on the ground as a symbol of a prayer at the time of the feast, that God would bless the people with harvest, with plentiful harvest, so that they could sustain their lives through the crops. And so the prayer was that God would pour out rain so that the rain would water the earth and they could raise their crops. Well, that pouring out of the water also was a symbol, not just for water to water the earth, but for God to pour out his Holy Spirit so that the people who are thirsty spiritually might have water. They might have water for their souls, and by God pouring out his Holy Spirit. Well, on this last day, the 8th day of the festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus stands up in the temple courts and he says in a loud voice, "Anyone who is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, and I will give him something to drink." And by this, John says, he meant the Holy Spirit, which the people were later to receive. So we see that Jesus is actually fulfilling this hope of Israel. The people of Israel were calling on God, not just to supply the relief for their physical thirst, but provide relief for their spiritual thirst. And that is exactly what God has done in Jesus Christ.